Checking in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Facebook's new mission. The social network says it is pivoting to more private communication. But what is the motivation behind the move? Plus, follow the money. Amazon is flexing its muscle in Washington, stepping up its lobbying efforts and spending a record amount of cash to get its DC agenda on track. And Recharge, Tesla making moves for its Model 3 rollout by revamping its charger network. Is the infrastructure in place to take demand to the next level? First to our top story, it is no surprise that Mark Zuckerberg is finding ways for the social network to change after the company was besieged by scandals and bad press in 2018. What is surprising is that he wants Facebook to go from more open and public communication to much more private. Zuckerberg says Facebook will emphasize communications among smaller groups, temporary posts, and technology that keeps outsiders and Facebook itself away from peering into what people are sending through its social network and the apps Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. One analyst is saying that sounds a lot like Snapchat. That analyst joins us now, Rich Greenfield with BTIG, who currently has a buy rating on the stock. Also with us, Wired editor-in-chief Nick Thompson, who had an extensive Q&A with Mark Zuckerberg right after he published the piece. Wired's piece is called Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook's Future and What Scares Him Most. Bloomberg Tech's Sarah Fryer is also with us, who covers Facebook. So, Sarah, walk us through the reaction to this stunning post from Mark Zuckerberg.
Well, some critics are calling it a victory after all of this criticism that Zuckerberg has faced over privacy. Now that he says it's really important. But I think the difference is really going to be in what we see Facebook do with this. It doesn't change the fact that they have their newsfeed. It doesn't change that their advertising business is built on personal user data. Not a lot changes about how Facebook's business works, and he didn't really talk about the advertising implications in his post the other day.
Now, Rich, you've been very bullish on Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg says that the news feed will remain, but that this will make ad targeting more harder. There will be less information to target ads to. Does that concern you?
I think it's honestly absurd, really, when you think about the fact of what is Facebook right now. It's something where you spend a lot of time browsing through news feeds in groups. The one thing you don't do a lot of, especially in this country, is you don't spend a lot of time messaging. When you go to message, I'm sure Sarah or Emily, if you go to message someone, you're generally using iMessage. Maybe you're using Snapchat if you're trying to reach someone younger, but you're not really using Facebook Messenger. Someone overseas is probably using WhatsApp for sure, but Facebook Messenger has not really caught on as the principal form in which you communicate, nor has direct messaging within Instagram. People are using it more, and I think it's a rapidly growing part of Facebook. But I think this, for Mark Zuckerberg and for Facebook, this is really trying to reclaim messaging. They want to dominate messaging and combine it with what they already do with Instagram stories, with Facebook stories, with WhatsApp stories. They want to have more time. They want to capture more of your daily time spent. And the one big place they're missing is messaging. And I think that's a big opportunity, not just to drive their content business over time, which has advertising, but really to drive the commerce business, which is in the very early stages. But I think they're taking very seriously is how to close that loop between content and marketing and commerce. And that's really the holy grail, is moving cars off lots and products off shelves. That's what this is all about, ultimately.
Now, Nick, Mark Zuckerberg told you that he sees private messaging growing the fastest. It's unclear if he meant on Facebook platform or other platforms. However, you astutely pointed out this raises a lot of questions. Did he really answer those questions when you spoke with him?
He answered some of the questions. He answered the question, maybe my central question was, the post was a little unclear about whether he's building a new network or whether he's going to just evolve the tools that Facebook has. And he was much clearer about that, which is that Facebook's current tools will continue to exist. They will evolve in this direction, and they will also be building something else. The biggest question is, if people do move more towards messaging, and if they do move off newsfeed, and particularly if they move to encrypted messaging, how do you monetize that? So yes, it will probably be some kind of payments processing. There will probably be some kind of Facebook coin that they will try to monetize. But the most interesting question is, how does a company that has turned into a $500 billion valuation based on big data collection and targeting off that data, how do they make money as they move into this new era?
Now, he told you the thinking is that there needs to be two types of platforms in the world. One is a more public platform, the digital equivalent of a town square, where you interact with lots of people at once. The other platform is the private space, the digital equivalent to the living room. But, you know, and you tried to press him on this. The question is, how do these two work together, Sarah?
Yeah.
What are the questions that you have, Sarah, about the actual execution here?
Well, I think the biggest question we have if we're going into this living room type space, especially in the encrypted type of messaging, is whether Facebook will still be able to police that content. And the answer is really they won't. I mean, we've seen what's happened with WhatsApp, which is an encrypted messaging platform and has contributed greatly to the spread of misinformation and illegal kind of content in countries where it's popular. And Facebook hasn't been able to do anything about it because they literally can't see it and they can't share information with governments. And so in some ways, in this new market that Facebook is trying to go into, they're washing their hands of that debate over what kind of content they should have oversight over.
Now, Rich, given that you said this sounds a lot like Snap, you know, are you as bullish as you have been on Facebook when it comes to revenue and also engagement?
Look, I think the reality is if you think about the original, concept behind Snapchat, I remember going for a walk on the Venice Boardwalk with Evan Spiegel, and he said, think about Snapchat this way. You can communicate all the time, just the way your sister or you, when you were younger, you would talk on the phone endlessly, an actual phone, to your friends endlessly, not texting them, but you would talk endlessly on the phone, and then in between you would watch television, linear television. And that was kind of the goal of the left and right side of Snapchat going back to the very early days. So messaging and content can certainly live together. I think when you look at Facebook and Instagram, they've principally been content consumption platforms for news and information. Videos obviously growing very quickly. But look at Instagram. I mean, it's going to be a bigger business than Facebook ultimately. People are spending more and more time on Instagram. Yes, that's coming through stories, which isn't yet as monetizable as the core news feed. But I think the reality is this is all about capturing more of your time. There's going to be lots of ad dollars to grow on Instagram over the years to come. And so I think we're even more bullish than we have been. I think a lot of the fear that's been stoked by the media, broadly by the media and by regulators, that Facebook's dying or this is the end of Facebook. Look around you. People are using Facebook and Instagram more than ever before in aggregate. My 15-year-old daughter is using Facebook groups. I mean, I never would have assumed that, you got teenagers using Facebook groups because they're really interesting. You've got tons of people at all ages using Instagram stories. This is just the beginning for Facebook and Instagram. I think there's a lot of great growth ahead. And while there's lots of things to tackle in terms of privacy and the issues that Sarah just raised, which I think are not easy challenges to deal with, I think the reality is Facebook has more resources than anyone else, other than probably Google, to deal with those challenges.
Nick, as a fellow proverbial member of the media, why do you think Mark Zuckerberg is doing this? Interestingly, he told you that he's not so worried about the business. What he is more worried about is safety and security, because there will be it'll be less easy for them to track whether bad behavior is happening. That said, and not to be cliche, but is Facebook doing this for the right reasons? Is this just to avoid government scrutiny, to appease the FTC? Is it because of the media?
I mean, it's an incredibly interesting question and a hard one to answer. I would say that there are a couple of reasons why Facebook is doing this. Number one, as he said in the note, he does see that this is what people are doing. He's got dashboards of how people are using their phones, dashboards of how people are using Facebook. He sees this as the trend that people are going. Number two, he's older now, right? When he started Facebook, he was very young. He didn't care about privacy. He's now mid-30s, 2 children. I can imagine caring more about privacy. Number three, I do think there is a real benefit with regulators. If you look at the fundamental threat to Facebook right now, it's antitrust regulation. And many of the people pushing it the hardest have proposed a solution where Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp are split apart. If you imagine them being much more integrated, suddenly the argument from the antitrust side becomes much harder. And then fourth, I do think it does involve public perception and also employee perception. There is a sense that Facebook has been on the wrong side of history for the last year. Facebook cares about it because they like to be liked, but also because they don't want their engineers to leave. And so pivoting to privacy encryption that most people, particularly in the engineering community, think are the right way to go is a good way with employee retention and morale, which has huge benefits for them. So I think it's a combination of personal motives, maybe cynical government regulation motives, management motives, and financial motives.
Though he did talk to you about the difficulty of, getting the right leadership in place within Facebook and leaders who agree that these are the right priorities. So it'll be interesting to see how Facebook manages this transition internally. All right, Wired editor-in-chief Nick Thompson, thank you so much for stopping by, along with BTIG's Rich Greenfield and our very own Sarah Fryer. Thank you all. Coming up, they were two of the biggest data breaches in history. Well, Congress is demanding more answers from the CEOs of Equifax and Marriott. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Equifax and Marriott were targets of two of the biggest data breaches in recent history. Sensitive data of more than 145 million people were stolen from Equifax. That includes Social Security numbers, credit card details, and more. Marriott had the records of 383 million guests breached, including passport numbers. Today, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations questioned their CEOs, and they were not happy. Take a listen to Senator Tom Carper, the ranking Democrat.
When hackers are able to obtain someone's personal information, the consequences are real. The constant stream of data breach notifications we see year in and year out is a sign to me that we could and should be doing a lot better.
To discuss, I want to bring in Chris Eng, Vice President of Research at the cybersecurity firm Veracode. Before that, he was an engineer with the NSA. And in Washington, we've got Bloomberg Law and Privacy data security reporter Sarah Merkin. Sarah, I'll start with you. What was revelatory about these hearings?
So this is the first time that the Marriott CEO testified since their data breach they revealed in November. And the lawmakers really were not happy about the steps these companies took before the data breaches. So they really went hard. They questioned them about what cybersecurity protocols they had in place and really wanted to know also what steps they took afterward to notify consumers about what had been revealed.
Now, interestingly, the Equifax CEO said they still don't know who stole the data. Take a listen to a quote from him today.
Our analysis is that there's been no evidence that the data has been sold or no evidence of increased identity theft as a result of Equifax data that was stolen in 2017.
So he says there's no evidence that the data was sold. I mean, what's the likelihood this data was taken and won't be used?
Pretty unlikely. Usually when we see a big data dump like that and it starts appearing on the dark web, then you know it's being monetized, you know it's being sold. When you don't see it appear, then it's the likelihood that it probably is a nation-state sort of actor and they're using it probably in a more targeted fashion, right? They're not looking to sell credit card records for $1 or $2 a piece, but they want to use it in a more strategic way.
Now, he's saying they still don't know who took it. Is that unusual now, 18 months on from this breach?
Attribution is a difficult task, generally speaking, but if you look at the report, especially the Senate came out with today, that really details the investigation in quite depth. They talk about how the server that was breached, they saw Chinese traffic coming from it once they were able to monitor that traffic, and they were looking at what was happening. They don't have any operations there, so it was weird that there was so much traffic generated from China. And so that was one form of attribution that seems pretty possible.
So what does that mean?
What it means is that either somebody is bouncing through China or it's actually China state actors themselves, which maybe are using that information. They're going to think about using, how are they going to target individuals, perhaps high-value individuals, with some of that information, whether it's Social Security numbers or other personal information. Anytime you have personal information that's otherwise difficult to come by, you can use it pretty effectively in a social engineering attack, a phishing attack, for example, where there's that nature of trust that you try to establish with that person by virtue of knowing information about them. So you could envision this sort of information being used in targeted attacks against individuals and sort of phishing attacks and so on.
Sarah, how does that differ from what we know about Marriott?
So with Marriott, they acquired the Starwood database system a few years ago. So theirs was different because they acquired a system that had already been breached since 2014. So theirs included passport information, some encrypted and some unencrypted. And they are also still looking to see how the data is being used, if it is at all.
And do they know who stole it?
As far as I know, they do not.
So, Chris, Senator Tom Carper, who, as you heard earlier, hit these companies very hard, and he said if the leadership that is running the company today was running the company when this happened, it wouldn't have happened. Is this a leadership issue?
There certainly were a number of process and leadership and cultural gaps in the Equifax breach when you just look at the number of lapses that happen, right? Nothing is one person's mistake. It's a cascading failure of multiple processes and things that happen. So, the number one rule in security is if you don't know something is there, you can't secure it. And they had very little visibility into their assets. They had very little visibility into how their software was built. So these open source components like Apache Struts, where they were being used. And so if you don't know that, you actually can't go secure those systems. And so clearly there's an increased focus on that today. I think the new leadership is putting an emphasis on that, and they realize that inventory issue, that open source issue, is something they need to focus on.
All right, Chris Eng of Veracode. Lots of open questions along with Bloomberg, Sarah Merkin. Thank you both. Coming up, Amazon is growing its presence in Washington with a record amount of lobbying spend, where the e-commerce giant is asserting its influence next. I'm Bloomberg Tech live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology and follow our global breaking news network TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. U.S. grocery chain Kroger tumbled the most in a year after its holiday performance, and full-year expectations disappointed investors, showing how tough things are for traditional supermarkets with the growing threat of online grocers. Kroger CFO Mike Schlottman spoke to Bloomberg about one of the biggest issues on investors' minds, and that is the rising threat from Amazon.
We have over 2,700 food stores today. We have about 11 million customers a day on average coming to one of our properties, and they live within a couple miles of our stores. We've been building out the digital platform. We feel we have the infrastructure with our brick and mortar to be able to serve our customers conveniently.
Speaking of Amazon, the e-commerce giant is stepping up its game in Washington. Federal records showed that Amazon lobbied more government entities than any other tech company last year. In 2018, the company spent $14.2 million on lobbying, outspending everyone in the industry except Google. That is a 460% increase over the last 6 years. This as CEO Jeff Bezos continues to clash with President Trump. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg's Naomi Nix. So, Naomi, talk to us about the trends you're seeing in Amazon's lobbying tactics as opposed to other tech companies.
Well, so Amazon has been increasing, as you mentioned, its spending on federal lobbying a lot in the last year. And what we're seeing now these days is now that it has an established Washington presence, it's really getting more aggressive in how it interacts with its competitors in Washington. So you're seeing Amazon butt heads with retailers, for instance, over a GSA proposed deal to sell office supplies to federal agencies. And you're seeing, Amazon interact in the procurement and cloud space as it butts heads with other tech companies for a $10 billion cloud deal. In addition to that, we're seeing Amazon hire, more key people to help it as it navigates potential, antitrust inquiries and as it navigates questions from lawmakers about the lack of diversity in its workforce. And so this is what we're seeing now is a more aggressive Amazon in Washington.
Why is Amazon doing this? Is it all about this Pentagon cloud contract?
So certainly the Pentagon Cloud deal is part of it. But I think, the bigger picture is that as Amazon expands into other markets and as it sort of widens the scope of its business, it's getting more competitors, right? And so if it gets into the grocery store space and it increases in that area, it's going to get probably some more pushback from existing businesses in that market in Washington as well. And so the competition it's facing in the marketplace is translating into competition in Washington.
How is Amazon throwing its weight around, and what is the impact that is having?
So one really good example is in the trade group space. So Amazon, was part of a trade group that was called ITI. It was a sort of a procurement division called ITAPS. And essentially, Amazon muscled its way and really, that group was advocating against it and Amazon pushed back and that group eventually disbanded. And in the meantime, Amazon, created an entirely new trade group to support its interests. And that's just one example of how Amazon is getting aggressive against its competitors while also supporting its own interests.
And how is Jeff Bezos himself operating in Washington, aside from, as we know, owning the Washington Post?
Yes. So in addition to the Post, Jeff Bezos is building a mansion here in Washington. And you're really seeing him increasingly sort of interacting with Washington's elite. He's going to more exclusive parties. He's showing up at events. Most recently, he was at the Alfalfa Club, where he, essentially was one of the stars of the show. He did a whole skit and joked about how, he might buy the National Enquirer and alluding to some of his more public issues there. And so this is, Jeff Bezos is no stranger to the nation's capital. And with the, HQ2 coming to Northern Virginia, that'll make Amazon no stranger to an increasingly larger group of policymakers here.
All right, interesting color there. Bloomberg's Naomi Nix, thank you so much for that update. Coming up, the topic of misinformation continues to spiral around Twitter, especially as a number of elections across Asia take place this year. Our conversation with Twitter's Asia chief is next. And later in the show, store closings, a request to hold its CEO in contempt of court, now slowing sales? Tesla's rough start to 2019 continues. We will discuss. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology Global Link, where we join Bloomberg Daybreak Australia to bring you the latest in global tech news. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco with Heidi Stroud-Watts in Sydney and Sherry An in New York. Let's get a look at the global tech stories of the day. Sherry?
Emily, Airbnb has agreed to buy Hotel Tonight in its biggest acquisition yet. The move comes as Airbnb continues to increase hotel listings on the site before its eventual public offering. Airbnb didn't disclose the financial terms of the deal, but according to PitchBook data, Hotel Tonight was valued at $463 million in a venture capital deal 2 years ago. SoftBank has launched a $5 billion technology fund focused on Latin America and named Marcelo Clore to run it. Initially, SoftBank is committing $2 billion to the Innovation Fund and will serve as the general partner. Clore will serve as CEO of SoftBank Latin America and continue in his other roles at the company, including COO as well as executive chairman of Sprint. And Etsy shares dropped during its first ever Investor Day Thursday after the company provided 5-year guidance that included a slowdown from 2018 revenue growth. The slump comes on the back of shares soaring near all-time highs as investors showed faith in the company's efforts to woo more buyers to the e-commerce site known for unique handmade crafts. And those are the top global tech stories we're watching. Emily.
Thank you, Sherry. Well, now candidates running in a slew of elections across Asia this year are taking to social media to share slogans, pitch policies, rankle rivals, and rouse crowds ahead of campaign rallies. Twitter's Asia chief tells Bloomberg's Juliet Sally how it's looking to restrict the use of fake news being spread across the platform.
It is an interesting time for us this year. Elections are important moments for Twitter. We promise to be able to show every side of the story, and what better way to do that when debates are happening in elections and so on and so forth. I'll give you an example. In markets like India and Australia, we're bringing some learnings from what we've done in the US, bringing things like a new ads transparency center, to be able to bring that level of transparency around who's advertising, what's being promoted on the platform, etc., while we continue to focus on our big pillar of our strategy, which is health, and being able to, to be able to enable people to have a free and open conversation with least disruption and malicious automation or other things.
Fake news is one thing, fake accounts is another. What's Twitter doing to, I guess, step up these concerns and particularly privacy concerns as well?
Well, privacy is incredibly important to us and has always been. If you've ever heard our CEO, Jack Dorsey, talk about this, it's very close to our heart. When it comes to fake accounts and other things, our effort has really been on the pillar of health and improving healthy conversations on the platform. Between efforts on product, on policy, we've made tremendous steps. We've seen that we're able to, up the number of issues that we're catching in time by 3 times from last year to this year. So there's a ton of effort that's being put across product and policy, both human as well as AI driven. And we're seeing that we're making great strides there.
So is AI really the front runner in terms of moving forward with, I guess, trying to crack down on fake accounts, but also streamline the content?
I think we do believe that for us to be in a position of healthy conversations on the platform, we need both manual policy, product, and AI effort. And certainly AI helps that effort scale. And to the same extent, our efforts in video on the platform help our advertisers be able to get to healthy and brand safe advertising conversations. So we use this approach across both sides of our business.
In terms of all the headwinds that we are seeing with global growth, how is Twitter positioned to grow in APAC?
You know, Asia continues to be an engine of growth for us at Twitter. We've had incredible success and momentum coming off of the earnings over the last quarter. We see our audience continuing to grow in Asia very healthily. We have some exciting markets, Thailand, Southeast Asia in general, as well as Korea being very exciting source of growth for us. And our revenue momentum continues to be strong. We see increasing demand for video and premium video. So our partnerships in the video space continue to thrive.
Is video the strongest component or contributor to revenue?
Well, it has been over the last year contributing to 50% or more of our revenue. So clearly that's where audiences are putting their time and their eyeballs, and it's also where advertisers are really driving engagement. Particularly, we see strength in the areas and the times when marketeers want to launch new services. Twitter is the platform, and Twitter Video particularly is the exciting offering for them.
In terms of how Twitter has evolved from a platform which was 140 characters or less to being able to push out further what your message is, and as you say, also video, how do you see Twitter positioned to grow and evolve in the coming years?
Well, I think we believe that we are positioned in a great way to be the conversation layer of the internet. The conversations could be text or video or images, but essentially enabling a connection in the world around topics that matter, so people can come to Twitter and see what's happening at any point, continues to be our strength and our value proposition. To that extent, in Asia, we've seen for instance, partnerships in the video space with Channel 7 and 7 Networks in Australia over My Kitchen Rules and interesting programming, strength with sport across the board. We think it's going to be an exciting year ahead across entertainment, sports and news.
In terms of the growth, you mentioned a couple of countries earlier. I know the Philippines is a huge one as well. You also mentioned Korea. What is driving, it's millennials really, but what is driving them to the platform?
Yeah, it is millennials. Asia has got 60% of millennials by 2020. We see that trend play out on our platform as well. K-pop is a big unifying trend across many markets in Southeast Asia. And we see bands like BTS, GOT7, EXO really drive amazing engagement with these millennial consumers. But Southeast Asia in general we see as a region of growth. And within that, we see Philippines engaging with TV content in very interesting ways. You'll often see TV trends become trends on Twitter within the region as well as globally. And K-pop seems to drive engagement in many markets, including Thailand, which is an exciting new growth market.
That was Maya Hari, Twitter's Asia Pacific VP. I want to bring in our own Selena Wang, who covers Twitter for us. How big is Asia Pacific region for Twitter?
International revenue in general has been a growing component of Twitter's overall revenue. If you look at the daily active user base, while it's been pretty much flat, barely growing or negative over the past few quarters in the United States, it's been pretty good growth every quarter internationally. And Japan is actually Twitter's second largest market, and growth in Japan has really been bolstering some of the declines in the U.S. over the past few years. Just in the fourth quarter, revenue in Japan grew 30%, outpacing that domestically. So Asia, Japan, Southeast Asia, India are all very important markets for Twitter, and increasingly so.
Selena, we saw during that interview with Juliet Zali this question of how they're going to be able to stop the spread of fake news on the platform, particularly as it is an election year for so many Asian countries this year. Have we seen them take measures to increase security and to be able to prevent that kind of thing from happening?
So there was an interesting new disclosure from Twitter that compared to the 2016 U.S. presidential elections, there was far less platform manipulation from foreign actors in the 2018 U.S. midterm elections. However, that being said, Twitter did still find activity from Iran, Venezuela, and Russia during the U.S. 2018 midterm. So what that really says is that they are getting better at surfacing and finding this manipulation, the fake accounts and the spam during election years, but they still have a long way to go. As the VP mentioned in her interview, they are making stricter enforcement policies. They're combining humans, review checkers, as well as algorithms to surface the most pressing and abusive content, and then using those stricter policies to be able to enforce that and get rid of more of the manipulation. I mean, this service is checking millions of spam accounts, potentially malicious accounts every week. So obviously there are parts that slip through the cracks, and Facebook, Google, YouTube, they all still have a very long way to go in terms of securing elections, but they're certainly more aware of it.
All right, Selena Wang from Bloomberg Technology, who covers Twitter. Thank you so much for joining us there. Well, much more ahead, so do stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has learned that the Pentagon is reviewing Elon Musk's security clearance after the SpaceX CEO smoked marijuana on a podcast. Musk went on the Joe Rogan podcast last year, and the moment quickly went viral. Protocol requires a federal employee or contractor to acknowledge any drug use for up to 7 years prior to their clearance request. Since Musk went on the show, SpaceX has won contracts for national security space launches, including one valued at nearly $300 million. Musk has refiled his security paperwork since he went on the show, this according to sources familiar with the matter. Sticking with Musk, a blog that follows Tesla reports sales are slowing down at the start of the year. Inside EV, this blog estimates that the company sold around 5,750 Model 3s in February and about 6,500 in January, a big drop-off from the record 25,000 sold in December. To discuss, I want to get to New York, where Dan Ives, Managing Director of Wedbush Securities, is standing by. Dan, does this concern you?
Look, I mean, to some extent, it's not new news in terms of the direction. We knew the EV tax credit roll-off in the U.S., demand's waned. And I think right now it's really about Europe. I mean, there's, I think some delivery issues that we saw at first, but I think there's been a pretty significant ramp positive in Europe that we believe should, continue through March. And I think this is more of a speed bump rather than the start of a negative trend as they transition to Model 3 on the mid-range, and especially with Europe and China rolling on.
Now, Elon Musk in the past has pushed back on Inside EV's numbers. Last year, he said, your numbers are wrong. Bear in mind, Tesla makes cars overseas on the East Coast in the first half of the quarter. How correct do you believe this blog's estimate of the sales are?
Yeah, I mean, look, we continue to believe that so far, if you look how it's tracking, and obviously the company just, spoke to investors calling a week ago, I think it's tracking obviously slightly below expectations. But nonetheless, I think most investors are looking at 1Q as really the trough quarter as they transition to what we're going to see in Europe and China as well as in the U.S. I do think that bark's a little worse than a bite here in terms of what we're seeing from demand. I think production's obviously been pretty steady. And I think demand will ramp up in March. But remember, Europe is the key to 1Q. And I think so far it's been pretty smooth, especially what we've seen over the last few weeks. And obviously the stock's had a lot of gut punches that we've seen over the last few weeks.
Now, meantime, Tesla is updating its charger networks. The goal to cut wait times in half. And of course, you've got competitors ramping up their EV rollouts this year with their own infrastructures. What impact will doubling down on the supercharger network have?
Look, that's really, if you think about the barriers to entry and their competitive advantage, it has been the supercharger network. And I think that's something that they do need to double down on, especially with EV competition increasing, not just in the U.S., but even in Europe. So I think that's a smart move. And I think, look, it just speaks to 2019 as a major transitional year for Tesla. Not just they invest further in supercharger, but if you look at Giga and the build out in Shanghai and obviously taking on debt there, the rollout in Europe, and especially in the U.S. I mean, it's all about that mid-range and obviously the 35K. As you see the EV tax credit hurt demand on the high end, it was expected, but no doubt this has been a white knuckle period for investors in Tesla, and you see it reflected in the stock.
Dan, what's your read on this issue, closing all the stores, moving to online only, the very abrupt nature of it, even after Tesla in the last quarter touted its retail strategy?
It came down to, for a 35K vehicle, if they were going to do this where it would be gross margin, neutral at first and ultimately something that would be toward target margins, they needed to ultimately do something like rip the Band-Aid off and close the stores. I mean, look, 78 to 80% of all sales are online. They're definitely going to have to figure out, especially the Model Y and some of the new models coming out from a test drive and making sure that there's no speed bumps there as consumers get the look and feel of the new models. But this is something where it's a risky move in the near term, but it was the right medicine for the long term from a margin perspective, but as well as just the strategy. And I think this is something where the knee-jerk reaction's been negative, but we do believe this is the right move for the long term for Musk and Tesla.
So, Dan, what is your outlook then on Tesla for this year, given the EV tax credit issues, given, this other story that's emerging out of China that potentially there are some Model 3s being delayed in customs in the middle of a trade war and a dispute over the CFO of Huawei, who's potentially being extradited to the United States? Yeah, it's just a few things for investors to worry about at night that own Tesla. And, we've continued to view this as 1Q is going to be the quarter where you saw a trough in terms of sales for Model 3. It was transitional sort of period, especially in Europe. And when you looked at what's happened on the EV tax credit, I think as they kind of navigate out of this period, you'll see profitability in 2Q. I do believe it's a self-funding model here, only a 30 to 35% chance that they have to raise $2 billion of capital. And I think this is one they will navigate through this period and be a much healthier company a year from now. And that's why we continue to view this as a name we're bullish on, even though it's obviously a hand-holding period. All right. Dan Ives, Wedbush Securities. Always good to have you here, Dan. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Still ahead, between SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic, competition to commercialize spaceflight is heating up. But the private industry's race to space isn't quite so new. We'll take a look at the history of private spaceflight next. This is Bloomberg. Tim Cook has changed his last name on Twitter. The social media took off Wednesday after President Trump flubbed the Apple CEO's name at the White House, referring to him as Tim Apple. Cook joined in on the joke, changing his last name to the Apple logo on Twitter. Love that one. Well, tech billionaires Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson are all making their names known in the space race. And while space exploration is typically associated with government agencies like NASA, this isn't the first time entrepreneurs have taken on the final frontier. Here's a brief history of private spaceflight.
The time is coming when the human race will get to the moon with rockets.
Private companies won't want to do this. How are they going to make money?
By charging for the ride.
Those crazy billionaires competing with each other.
Modern-day rocket man wants to send you to Mars.
Difficult, dangerous, good chance you'll die.
The private industry space race, it's on.
We tend to think that space exploration and human spaceflight is all about governmental agencies like NASA. But it wasn't really always like that. Some of the very first steps by the early rocketry pioneers were funded by the private sector.
In the US, it begins with the University of Clark professor Robert Goddard. It's 1920 and he publishes a method of reaching extreme altitudes, mentioning that rockets could be used to carry payloads to the moon.
They called him the Moon Man and laughed.
The Times editorial writer implied that your husband didn't even know high school physics.
He did not let such things deter him from his experiments.
In 1926, Goddard successfully launches the first liquid-fueled rocket. Money from the family of the mining magnate Daniel Guggenheim soon follows.
They provided him funding in today's dollars at the scale of tens of millions of dollars. What's interesting is that at the very start of this period in the 1920s, there was actually a great amount of enthusiasm and a great amount of belief in the potential for these private rockets to go to space.
The German war machine gets underway.
The Second World War gives rockets a whole new meaning.
And then the knowledge of rocketry became critical to Cold War, and in the 50s and 60s, rocketry was almost exclusively a governmental affair. The private sector, in terms of companies, was essentially working as contractors to the U.S. government.
It's not until 1982 that a serious effort is made to build a privately funded rocket. The idea comes from a Texas businessman, David Hanna Jr. Conestoga 1 is pieced together from a repurposed ballistic missile.
It may not have had the majesty of an Apollo nor the thunder of a shuttle, but it flew, and that's what counts.
Everything speeds up at the turn of the millennium when freshly minted millionaires take interest. One of them is Jeff Bezos.
I don't actually hold out great hopes, but if I could do anything, I would like to go help explore space.
A few months later, he sets up Blue Origin. Then Elon Musk starts SpaceX, and yet another tech millionaire, Anousheh Ansari, and her family promise to foot the bill for X Prize. This is a $10 million award for reaching the industry's holy grail, a reusable manned space vehicle.
2, 1, ready, fire.
In 2004, Spaceship One wins the prize.
There it is, a craft that has been to space and back today, right in front of you.
Richard Branson buys the rights, turns it into Virgin Galactic, and in the same year starts accepting commercial reservations for future suborbital flights.
Although we are seeing a lot of billionaires have interest in spaceflight, their investments still pale in comparison to governmental investments. And they have now managed to partner, in many cases, with U.S. government agencies. And NASA, for example, is, in most years, SpaceX's primary customer.
But there are setbacks.
Local company's mission for NASA explodes into a ball of fire and debris.
Deadly crash involving Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two,
a SpaceX rocket bringing supplies to the International Space Station. As you can see there, it exploded.
Eventually, in 2015, Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket becomes the first to take off and land vertically after reaching space. Shortly after, SpaceX goes even further, sending its Falcon 9 to orbit altitude.
The other major milestone will be the first tourists on commercial suborbital vehicles, and I'm not going to predict who's going to be there first, but the hope is that by having more competition amongst commercial companies and by leveraging advanced technologies, that we're going to be able to reduce the cost of going into space.
Launch. 2019 is the year that SpaceX and Boeing are gearing up to finally take astronauts up to the International Space Station. The first private lunar lander is on its way to the moon, and Chinese companies are joining the space race as well.
For well over 100 years, people have been dreaming and thinking and planning for a future for humanity beyond this planet. And that includes a future for humanity on the surface of the moon, a future for humanity on Mars, and even farther still. And as long as we have the social goal of continuing to expand our knowledge of the cosmos, then the ambitions and dreams of individuals are going to be an important part of realizing those goals.
And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. On Friday's show, we've got a great lineup of female guests. It is International Women's Day. We'll have Natasha Lamb from Arjuna Capital and Nicole Quinn with Lightspeed Venture Partners. That's all for today. I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.